I'm Tracy Nicholas, and my co-host Tanya Carwin and I are passionate folklore practitioners. To us, folkloring is more than a podcast. It's our commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you. In episode 2, we're going to be talking about hidden in plain sight, or magical tools around the house. And we're going to be discussing using what you have available around you. Now, we will get into a little bit deeper dive about creating sacred objects in episode number 4, and that will talk a little bit more about making things and creating things out of what you have. So if you are interested in that topic, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it.
Great, yes. And today we're going to be talking about using what you already have around the house and things that aren't necessarily meant to be used for folklore or magic or witchcraft or any of those things, because the folk almost never had access to specialized tools. Yeah. So Tracy, this week, have you been folkloring at all?
I have been folkloring. It's kind of unusual, but 3 separate times this week, I have had a run-in with a skunk. And I'm not sure if it's the same skunk, right? But I was early one morning, I was taking the recycling out, and there was a skunk in my path. And so that happened. Then the next morning, I woke up, and when I came downstairs, I have an older house, and the windows, I haven't put plastic over them for the winter yet, so a lot of air comes in. And a skunk had just sprayed when I had come outside, and I could smell it in the house. And I was like, oh, that's weird. I wonder if it's that same skunk from, the other day. And then in the middle of the day, I had run out to do some errands, and I was coming home. And as I drove back up, again, I smelled skunk spray. And so I thought, what is going on with this? And I thought, you know what? I'm going to look up what the symbolism behind the skunk is.
Yeah.
And so I jumped on and I did that. I found out that the skunk is a fairly peaceful animal. They don't want to fight. They will defend themselves when need be, but they'd rather run away if they could. So it's about how can you calmly approach situations and not right away be jumping in and being, hostile. But it's also about, once a skunk sprays, it takes them several days to build back up. And so it's about using resources wisely. Defend yourself if you need to, defend your energy, whatever that is, but make sure you actually need to do it. I was spending a lot of time and energy on a particular person that I wasn't spending time and energy on myself. And I thought, I really need to look at my resources. So that's what I did this week.
That is awesome.
Okay, and how about you? Have you been folkloring?
I have, just a little bit. My oldest is home from college for a couple of days, and she's like a crafty kind. And so she was asking for some materials. She wanted to make a little autumn fairy doll. And so I got her all the stuff. And then she needed several different needles for her project. And I realized that my needles were like all over the place. So it took me forever to get a collection going. So then, since all the stuff was out already, I decided I was going to make a needle case so that I could just keep my needles in one place, nicely organized. And I embroidered on the front of this needle, it's like felt, and then I embroidered on the front of this needle case a sign for Mokosh, which is a Slavic goddess of needlework, women's work, spinning, all that stuff, just so that I have kind of a reminder when I sit down to do things with needles, that there's a history there. So yeah, and it came out really nice. And it's a very simple symbol. It's kind of hard to explain, but if you look it up online, it's readily available. It's like an X with the areas between the X filled in with squares. So, but it looks lovely.
That's more than a little folkloring. I mean, I think it's important to point out that even though we're focused on this, it's hard for us to make time too. I mean, all I did was look stuff up online. So,
yep, for sure.
Okay, let's get into it. Hidden in plain sight. We want to start with why you would even need to hide things in plain sight if you do, because a lot of people, they've got lots and lots of, different symbolisms and stuff, but some people don't have that or don't want that.
Right.
And so we want
Right.
to talk a little bit about why. And I think the first point is that for a lot of people, they're not, I'm gonna call it, I kind of don't like this phrase, but I think it'll make sense to people. They're not out of the broom closet yet.
Right.
And maybe they never will be. And so they don't really have family that they want to discuss it with, or friends, or they live in an area where it's something that people wouldn't understand, or they just are a private person and they want to keep it to themselves, but they want to still enjoy their spirituality at home, right?
Yeah, and also not everybody wants that to be their aesthetic in their house, or even if you're not necessarily in the broom closet, but you have like lots of people come over, you might not want that to always be the subject of discussion. Yeah, I remember this one time I have this tiny little, it doesn't even look like a altar so much, but I have this tiny little altar on the bar between my kitchen and my dining room, and one of my daughter's friends, they're always over, and there was like, I don't know, maybe there was like something special happening that day and it looked a little bit more like an altar, and one of them said, oh, and like, what is this all about? And my daughter was like, oh, that's just mommy's witchy shit. But which was fine in that moment, but maybe, if a prospective employer was over, or one of my super Christian elderly mountain neighbors, like, you might not want that necessarily to be, that's what we're talking about right now.
Right. And I mean, I certainly have rooms that have more of a, witchy or folkloric aesthetic to them, and a lot just don't. It's sort of, I like to have different feels when I walk around my house, and I don't necessarily need to talk to people about it. I've had business meetings in my home. I've had, lots of Zoom meetings, and I don't necessarily feel like it matters in every area of my life. Much like I would talk about my romantic ties in a business meeting. That's my personal stuff.
Right.
And we must point out the fact that there are places where it's just straight up dangerous to say that I'm pagan, or I'm a witch, or I practice magic. And so I think that's important to understand, that not everybody can. And so it's a way of approaching the world spiritually, but a way of not having to tell other people what you're doing.
Right. And also, we're looking at a lot of the aesthetic that we see around things like this are really, it's a very modern invention, right? Like, you could, like, if you're looking at very traditional, let's say folk painting or folk embroidery or things like that, you could plaster your house with that and nobody would ever suspect any sort of pagan leanings, but like, if you have cauldrons and Baphomet pictures and, lots of, and it's great for people who are like, that makes them feel really great and they feel like they can and should arrange their lives that way. That's awesome too. Like, do absolutely what you want and can do. Right now we're just talking about, if you can't or don't want to, how can you still infuse your home with folklore and magic?
Well, I think that's important, because when we think about sort of this modern aesthetic, that's not what people, getting back to the idea of incorporating folklore and folkloring, it's not what people did. They used what they had. So there's that part of it, but then there's also, if you're using more everyday kind of objects and not special ritual objects, then you are really folkloring more, because you're infusing all your everyday items with your daily magic. And that's, I think that's really getting back to a more traditional kind of use.
Exactly. Yeah. And like, how everything is magic, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And that's important, because if it's sort of like going to church, right? If you think that that's the only place that you can talk to your deity, then it's not part of everything that you do. And I think that that's one of the important parts, one of the important things that folklore teaches us is that it does have to do with every aspect of our life.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, and there's a part of it that has to do with convenience too. Like most of my work, whether it's magical or not, gets done with a regular kitchen knife. So I don't have to keep all these special knives for different, like I know in like traditional Wicca, there's like the white knife and the black knife, and the white knife is used for cutting herbs, and the black knife is only used, the atami is only used for directing energy, and like that just becomes a lot. And I don't know how to make knives myself. So then, now it becomes you have to buy knives from people, which just also might be a deterrent.
Right. I love to cook. I cook everything pretty much from scratch. I do not use much processed food. And so I've got a fantastic set of knives. And when I look at the knives, that I've bought at the Ren Fair or the magical shops, those they're not sharp like my kitchen knives. They're not as useful as
Yes.
my kitchen knives. They often are double bladed, and so there's like a sharp side on
Yeah,
sides of the blade,
on both sides. Yeah.
and so they're just when I think about using them, there's no real use for me to have them. And my chalice that I bought that's pewter, I mean, the only thing I do with that is dust it, right?
Yeah, right.
Because
Yeah,
I don't want to drink out of it because it's dusty.
yeah, that's funny. Um, so yeah, maybe we should move on with what can you use, finding the tools that you already have. And like you mentioned your cup and your chalice. And I have a story about that on that same little altar that I bar. I always put a little offering of water every morning. And that water sits in a lid, and it's a lovely little espresso cup, handmade ceramic, that I bought so many years ago for my stepson when he was teeny tiny, where he would get his tea in that cup. And, 15 and huge right now, so he needs the biggest mug he can find for his tea. So that cup now sits on the altar with water in it for spirit. And also my cat loves to drink from it. But that cup is still special, even though, it used to just be a teacup.
Right. And just
Yeah.
that,
And
I think that when it's something that has meaning for you above and beyond, I bought this at a cool store, when it really does have a story like that behind it, it is more magical. And that's, now that you've shared this story with us, you've shared the folklore of that cup and how it came
uh-huh,
to be.
right. You just mentioned knives. I also cook almost everything from scratch, but I don't have a massive set of. I have one really good chef's knife that I do almost everything with. But I have this Mora knife, which is like, I guess, a Scandinavian brand of knife, I think, and a lot of the primitive skills folks use them. And I bought mine years and years ago at a primitive skills gathering, and that is the knife that I use mostly for crafting if I'm making baskets or things like that. And so that one is kind of like, so most of my crafting is definitely infused with folklore and tradition and a spiritual sense for me. So that is the knife that usually gets used for that. I made a nice rawhide hilt for it. No, that's, what is it called? Like, that's what it sits in. But yeah, that is, and it's also not only used in ceremony. I will go and cut herbs with it or cut hazelnuts from it. So yeah, that's my knife story.
I will say that I have, at some point in my crafting, I do a lot of sketching and painting when I'm feeling artsy. I will say I have stopped using coffee mugs and cups for my brushes because there has been more than one occasion where I have had some paint water.
Yeah, yeah.
You have to be careful when you're using everyday items.
Uh-huh. This is true. Yes, for sure.
But I think there's other easy items that everybody, well, not everybody, but most people have around the house, like candles and incense, and I think that those are easy when you're looking at stopping and taking a moment. I mean, even if you can't build a fire, if you can light a candle and look into the flame, I think that it
Right.
grounds you in a particular way of, that sort of dancing life that is the flame.
Yeah, and especially for people who are not like, especially in the winter months, like we have a wood stove, so we're like, I feel like I have the fire element in my life quite a bit. And in the summer, we're always outside, so more fire. But yeah, like just lighting a candle sets such a mood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, such a like bringing in that particular element. And like, yes, it's lovely to have beeswax candles, but just the simple tea light candle is still flame, is still fire.
Right, right. And
Yeah.
what I've taken to doing, I've got one of those wax melters, and
Uh-huh.
so the tea light goes in, and what I've done instead of using the nasty, commercial
Uh-huh.
perfume, I've been putting beeswax in, and the beeswax has been melting, and so then the air smells like that, and
Yep.
it's lovely.
Yep. Yeah, I often make beeswax like I buy the beeswax locally and then I make candles, and I just got this silicone mold. Actually, I got a few, but one of the silicone molds I got are little pumpkin shaped. So
Hmm.
they're like, I'm looking at one right now that sits on the Halloween runner on my table. And it's so like yeah, the beeswax smells amazing and it burns really well. Also, I think it clears the air and like actually clears the air.
Right.
Um, yeah, but yeah, and again, like that's a bit more than most people might want to get into. But just a candle is great. And then the same kind of goes for herbs.
Hmm.
So much spell work uses herbs where you might want to go out and gather it on a full moon, standing on your left leg, spinning around twice, not talking to anybody, which is great. But also, you could probably just pull the cinnamon sticks from your spice cabinet to use.
Right. And going back to the idea that people historically have used what they have, it's what's
Right.
growing around them and sort of
Uh-huh.
the what nature surrounds them, because that they weren't going to be spending money, trying to get some exotic herb for their magic work, because
Right.
they didn't have it, and it wasn't, it was difficult to do and
Right.
expensive. And so pulling something, I mean, it wouldn't occur to me to keep magical herbs separate from my other herbs because they're my herbs.
Well, yes, they're super poisonous.
Unless, well, I mean, I don't mix them together. I keep them in separate
Right.
jars, and I know what's in them.
Right.
I am definitely, I don't tend to have many poisonous herbs around. So, okay, so other things that you might, we've talked about the cups and the knives, I think have a lot of symbolism in them,
Mhm.
as does flame, and so other things that have symbolism, I think herbal symbolism is very interesting because a lot of herbs do have properties that match up with what their magical properties are or what people are
Yeah.
using them for. But then I think about, and I am a big fan, I am not in any way slamming this, but then I think about crystals and stones,
Uh-huh.
egg stones. I love them. I do. It's terrible. I have 11 billion crystals around my house. Um, but I think that the symbolism there is interesting too, because sometimes it's based on color, sometimes it's based on just whatever properties that it contains, whatever minerals, and based on that.
Uh-huh.
I think that it's also important to note that the rock that you found at the beach when you were there hanging out with your family can be just as powerful of a symbol.
Yeah, I am not in the loving crystals camp. I have a few around, but I feel really conflicted about. I can't really tell if they're real or laboratory made. If they are real, do I know that they were ethically harvested and by whom? So I much more am interested in like just rocks. And I happen to live on a small river, so there's no lack of river rocks for me to find. I was doing a little bit of research before we started this podcast, and there's a couple of people that I want to mention who've written interesting things about just regular rocks. One of them is Byron Ballard, who is actually pretty local to where I live. And she wrote a book called Asphodity and Madstones, which is all about Appalachia folk magic. And in this, but I'll link that in the show notes. In this book, she talks about gravel, and here's like a little sentence that she writes, which just like hit me. It said, "Here," and this is a quote, "Here is what that humble gravel is, dear reader. It is the heart of ancient mountains." And that just struck me, like the gravel in my driveway is the heart of ancient mountains. Why do I need to go look any further? And there is another book by a guy named Aidan Wachter. I will also link that. The book that I'm talking about it's called Six Ways. And in it, he has a specific ritual about connecting. Like he has a black stone and a white stone. You go out and find it. And there's like, it's a huge, pretty involved ceremony, ritual. But it is pretty awesome. If you want to get into more connecting to your local simple rocks that you just picked out of a river, and maybe we'll throw back into that river at the end of it. Another thing that we wanted to mention, I think, was wands. People use wands quite a bit, but a wand is really just a stick of wood. And I think traditionally you're not supposed to cut them from trees. They're supposed to come to you. So like a fallen branch, even in a park. After a good storm, you'll find fallen branches.
Right. And I think when we're talking about sticks of wood and their use, I use wooden spoons when I'm cooking for stirring, and I don't need a staff for walking, but I can appreciate that people do, and it's useful. And I don't do a lot of hiking because I live in a very flat area, but I think that just being aware of those gifts, and I would be very hesitant to cut anything off of a live tree unless it was for safety purposes, right? Because that it's killing something living, even if it's only a part of that living thing. And so if it has already dropped from the tree and the tree is not useful to the tree anymore, then you're right, I feel much better about using it.
I want to dovetail into your don't need a staff for walking. The thing is that they are finding, this is in like Scandinavian mythology and history and archaeology, where the staff carriers, they were called the vulva, which were kind of like shamans, I think, witches, and they carried a staff. But then it turns out that staff was almost always a distaff. So already, which is a staff that you tie flax or wool to spin from. So that is another excellent example where this household object becomes a sacred object.
Right. Or a broom, for that matter.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And I think,
or really everything.
Well, right. Everything is magic. But and again, it's this symbolism of the wood and the growth. And I think that when we're looking at why people use different objects in their magic, I think that part of folkloring is to be aware of the practical uses. And that's part of how you use it into your life. If you're going to be cleaning the floor anyway, how do you make that a more mindful experience, really?
Right, exactly.
So if we keep going on the idea of found objects like the rocks and the sticks, then there are things that you'll find outside, feathers, and can be symbolic of a lot of different things, again, based on not only the fact that it is a feather and what the bird uses it for, but the colors as well. And then other things that nature gives us, acorns, roots, nuts.
I'm a particular fan of buckeyes that come down in the fall. They're like a symbol of abundance and fertility, but they're just so lovely and shiny and brown, and you can't really eat them.
I was going to say, those are poisonous, right?
Yeah, you can't eat them. You can make laundry soap out of them, apparently. I haven't tried that yet, but we usually have a pile around the house in the fall time because we have some buckeyes on the land. Yeah, and they're just lovely to look at. And there's like all sorts of traditional games that are being played with like they're called conkers, I think, in Britain. So there's lots of traditional games that you can play with conkers. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I have a park across the street from my house, and there is a ginkgo tree in the park. And it's very unusual because it is a female. And yeah, and so I always was wondering about this, why, there are some trees that have a male and a female, and they need each other to, propagate. And so not all trees, obviously, but some. And so when it was starting to drop the seeds every year, this older woman was coming and gathering them up day after day. She'd be gathering them up. And so I started thinking about that a bit. And what I discovered was, and people talk about, oh, nobody ever used to have allergies, right? Well, there was a time as a city dweller when people were starting to plan out landscaping and parks and all of that kind of thing, where they put trees that are along a sidewalk or a roadway. They made the decision, well, we don't want a bunch of fruit dropping to where people walk. Right. So they decided to only plant male trees, which in the spring, what happens is the male trees give off their pollen anyway, because they're doing their thing. And so there's all this pollen in the air that is not being used by the female trees. Oh. And
I had no idea.
Yeah, and the funniest part of this all is if they had just planted all female trees, they wouldn't have gotten the fruit because they wouldn't have had any of the pollen to. So but that's I think. And so when we talk about, oh, people never used to have allergies. Well, we're changing things, and that's important to remember. And I always wondered what this woman did with the ginkgo seeds, because they're pretty toxic. And I know that there are.
Are they? I thought they were edible, but I've never tried one.
Well, the outsides are definitely toxic, because I went and picked one up once and I got a rash from it. And you can ingest the ginkgo seeds, but you have to prepare them in some particular way, and it takes lots and lots of soaking and changing the water. Yeah, and I was not going to do that. Yeah. So
yeah. What about bells and chimes?
Well, I think there's a lot of sound that can be, there's a lot of folklore around using sound in order to clear energy. Yeah. And I think it can also be sounds that we make. I think that it's clapping and singing and drumming. And all of those are pretty easily available to us. And bells are interesting because lots of people have wind chimes and other kinds of bells that they have, and no one thinks twice about that. You don't have to even comment on that because it is so ubiquitous that people they like it. It's a pretty sound, and why not have a pretty sound? And for me, in the winter months particularly, believe it or not, I have an app on my phone, and it's called Mindfulness Bell. And it just runs on my phone all the time. And on occasion, the bell will ring. And it stops me. And I think, okay, what's happening in this moment? What am I experiencing? What is the air like? Am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Tired? And it slows my day down so much by paying attention to it, because you can just start rolling and never look up until you look around and go, how did it get to be dark out?
Right.
And exactly. So I think, and if people hear it when I'm out and about, or if I forget to turn it off, and they're like, oh, are you getting a text? And I'm like, no, it's my mindfulness bell. And I've never had anyone say, oh, that's weird. They're like, oh, that's really a great idea. And I don't have to tell them why I like it or where it comes from or anything like that.
Right. It's awesome. Yep. Yeah.
And again, like I was saying earlier, whatever sounds that there are, I really like singing bowls, and I enjoy playing them, and it's calming for me. And so I think that if you decide that, that's a great sound, hey, that's great. But if you decide that you don't have time or you don't want to have anything that is resembling an instrument, when I meditate, I go on YouTube and I use music. And I was never able to meditate before because my brain was just working too fast. And I get different sort of calming for however long I want. And so I think that when you're thinking about sounds to help support it, again, it's in the way that you look at these things, right? It's not in the things in and of themselves. And that's why it's so easy to have all of this around you and have it be part of your practice.
Exactly.
And that really goes for any object that you have that's meaningful, right? Like if you've got a beloved figurine that you got as a child, I still put the very first Christmas tree ornament that I ever bought for myself when, I was setting up my allowance, and that still goes on a place of honor on the tree. And that's my little ritual.
Yeah.
So it can be anything that you have that you enjoy or that has meaning for you.
Right, exactly. Another thing that I wanted to mention, because I think it's like really great in so many different ways. The word is signing or seining, and I believe it comes from Celtic, Scottish particularly tradition. It's basically asperging water with an herb. So dip a rosemary branch into blessed water, and that's what you use to clear the area. Mm-hmm. It's used instead in Scotland. It's used instead of smoke cleansing, which, especially here in North America, is just very ubiquitous and kind of problematic because a lot of people call it smudging, but that comes from Native American tradition, which is a closed tradition. So unless you were taught by a Native American person, it's really not appropriate. Smoke cleansing in and of itself smudging is a whole different thing. And then often what is being used, what was that?
I think it's interesting too, because as far as I know, the word smudging itself is not a Native American word, but the practice is. And there's a lot of debate around it. I think a lot of cultures have smoke cleansing, but when I consider using it, I'm really careful about that because it's an air quality issue as well. If you're closed up in your home, even if you have your home open, you're introducing particles into the air that you're breathing in. And so it's definitely not a daily practice for me, just because I want to be mindful of that. I live in a place where there's a lot of pollution anyway. And so I want to, give myself the healthiest experience I can. And that's one of the reasons why I use beeswax instead of other candles, because those definitely burn in a more pure way.
Yep. Yeah, we do the same. And we also, there's the occasional smoke cleansing that happens around our place. Mostly it happens outside. And my husband usually does it. He burns cedar on coals. He was taught by a Lakota chief, and so he feels good about doing it. I never do it, but he will smoke cleanse me in the space and all that stuff. And occasionally we'll do it inside if the atmosphere feels if there's been lots of fighting or things like that. Sure. But yeah, in general, there's not so much. My youngest daughter is kind of big on the incense, so she'll burn some incense in her room. But yeah, the cleansing with water and herbs feels really great to me. And as a person of European ancestry, that definitely feels respectful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, I know there's a lot of conversation around using white sage and where you source it. I don't use white sage, but I do use sage. I grow it myself. And there are certain herbs that you can burn that are not bad for, your lungs and all of that. Mm-hmm. Mullein? I think it's mullein that is actually really good for your lungs if you smoke. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it is just being mindful of what the benefit is. And I tend to want to do any kind of cleansing seasonally. I feel like things build up over the season. Yeah. And so that's kind of what I focus on, because I feel like it's not a thing that needs to happen every day for me, because I'm not, there's not a lot of dark energy in my house. I live by myself. And so if it's something that I'm feeling down or whatever, I'll do it. But it's not something that feels like there's a lot of fighting here or anything like that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Yeah, did you want to mention more or?
well, just a couple, and I don't think we need to go into such great detail, but
Okay.
I think that there's also our pets, our animal companions that we have. There's a lot of symbolism around those. I was talking about the skunk earlier. And so I think just knowing that symbolism and knowing that you have a connection to those animals can really just be part of your day-to-day existence. You're going to pet them. You're going to probably talk to them if you're me. And I also know that a lot of people will grab whatever the nearest book is, and they'll open it up to a page and read it and kind of read into what that meaning has for them that day. And I think that these are a lot of easy ways that we can just have these objects around.
Yes, totally. Totally.
Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the different elements. We've talked a little bit about knife and fire, and I think those are also it's really easy to incorporate the elements. Most people in our culture now have water that comes right into the home. And so and how are you being mindful when you're washing dishes or you're showering or you're taking a bath or you decide to go swimming? So those I think are just things to stop yourself and think, hey, what does water mean to me in this case? Is it cleansing something? Is it? And so I think the same, we talked about the air and burning incense or herbs, and you open the windows to clear things out. That's another way.
Exactly. Yeah. And then just in general, air, like I know for me, it tends to, like, I'm a very airy person, and like any kind of system that you're looking at, Western astrology and then Eastern astrology and like pretty much every system. So air tends to aggravate me. Like I hate driving in a car with the window open. I hate fans on my body, things like that. But it might be completely different. And it is completely different for people who have different constitutions, and where some of that extra airiness really benefits them.
Yeah, I love feeling a breeze, or I don't like as much having the fan on me because it feels like it's like this extra pressure. But that moment when a breeze kicks up and you feel it across your skin, I think that's amazing. I have my windows open for as long as I possibly can during the course of the year. And people think I'm crazy because I rarely use my air conditioning because I like feeling the actual air. And so but incorporating it to how it works for you, I think is, back to the point. And for me, I don't take vitamins because for a variety of reasons, but I don't do that. And so but I also tend to be very low on magnesium a lot of the time. And I take Epsom salt baths so the magnesium. And I think that I'm not doing anything different than I would be to just get the magnesium. But when I think about, I'll add a little dash of, salt, like regular salt, and think about sort of cleansing properties of it. And it just, with how I do things already.
Yeah, exactly. And it's similar, I think. So we talked about water, we talked about air, similar to fire. So in every system that you look at, I lack fire. And I definitely sit practically on top of the wood stove in the winter. And I do love being outside. Like I'll go weed the garden in 90-degree heat in the middle of the day because it's feels really great to me. But it's often the opposite for people who do have a lot of fire in their constitution or in their chart or whatever, who are already very fiery. But yeah, there's so many things, like, so fireplace we talked about candles and wood stoves. Also outside fires, like if a campfire, if you don't have a wood stove in your house, you could maybe have a campfire out in the back or in a campground.
Oh, I have an interesting fact about being, how when you're sitting around a campfire, it seems like the smoke is always coming right at you, like wherever you move to.
Yeah.
It's interesting
Yeah.
because the way that the fire works, if you're sitting around a fire, the fire is pulling in air from the sides. And
Ah.
and so where your body is, it blocks air that's coming in to feed the fire. And so
Uh-huh.
you're not imagining it. It really does always follow you around the fire.
That's awesome. Yeah, I did not know that. So also cooking over an open flame, even if that's a gas, like if you have the option to choose between a gas stove and a electric stove, if you're the kind of person who likes to be around fire, we have a gas stove that we run on propane because we're too far out of city limit. Like we're pretty rural here, but we run it on propane. And I specifically asked, like that's what I wanted was a gas stove because I much prefer cooking on gas, even though I think there's like they're trying to have rules and regulations against it now because of air quality, maybe.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting because my house was built before they would typically have like a full home furnace in. And
Uh-huh.
so different areas where, they were venting out of, areas above a window and things like that. But at some point, they modernized things and put a furnace in. And after I'd been living here maybe 10 years, the furnace was going out. And so I had the
Uh-huh.
furnace replaced, and it was a high efficiency furnace that, pumps out the side of the house. And I didn't need a chimney anymore. So I had the chimney taken out. And when I did have the chimney taken out, it was taking up a huge portion of one of my rooms. And I decided I was like, maybe I could put a fireplace in there. So I ended up getting a ventless gas fireplace.
Uh,
And so I will still, even though I have a remote control to turn it on, I still refer to it as building a fire.
yeah, that's funny. Yeah. And so then the last element we want to talk about is earth.
Mhm.
You already mentioned crystals. I already mentioned stones, which is a perfect way to draw some earth energy into
Mhm.
your house or into your sphere.
I don't know if this is a thing where you are, but around where I live, there's a big movement. For a while they were doing yarn bombing, where they put
Uh-huh.
yarn and stuff. Now they're doing painted rocks, and
Oh, yeah.
people leave them out for other people to pick up, and they just paint them, and you find them in random places. And I think that that's a lot of fun in a way of connecting with someone else, even though you're not in the same place at the same time, but you've got that sort of grounded energy that at some point you both were standing right there.
That's so fun. That's the fun part about living in a city. I think you get more of those projects around you.
Right. Yeah, definitely. You get less nature. So there's that.
Yeah.
So the other thing I think we wanted to touch on before we start to wrap things up here is other things that you can have in your house and not create a complete, pagan aesthetic. We want to talk a little bit about altars and
Mhm.
building altars, the kind of altars you have. For me personally, I create a garden altar every year that I take
Uh-huh.
down. That I take down my garden. I have a small altar in my kitchen, and I have a work altar that is about abundance and building up that kind of
Mhm.
thing. And then I also have a main altar that is just, for my home, and it's a lot of random items that don't necessarily scream I'm going to work magic. And they all sit on top of my fireplace that I had installed. And
Uh,
it's like all of them just kind of look like decor. They're not
yeah.
anything, I don't have a lot of symbols that would say, oh, here's a pentagram or whatever. I just don't, I'm not into that. So I don't have that, but it's meaningful objects to me. I bought a piece of art once that is a face, and it happened to be green. And so that's my green man, but it's really just a sculpture I bought at an art fair. And
Right.
so I think that, there's a lot of different kinds of altars that you can build, and they can look a lot of different ways.
Yeah. So for me, I have a little altar that sits, as I said, on the corner of my bar. And that usually one of the things that I do always there is I make a altar for Mercury when Mercury is retrograde. So then it usually has appropriately colored flowers and a candle and sometimes a statue or a picture of Mercury. Right now, it has the last of the zinnias from the garden. It always has the little cup of water, and it has a little pumpkin candle on it right now. And it also has a bell that also always kind of sits there. And then I also have a little work altar, the same thing with abundance. It has a tarot card on it in a stand, flowers, a candle, and a little, like one of those antique green glass jars with hagstones that I found.
Nice.
And then what we do, and it's, my kids are older now, but it started when they were really little. We always have a nature table going
Mhm.
on. And so that just sits at the edge of my dining room table. And currently it has one, two, three, four pumpkins that we grew and one little gourd that we grew. The gourds did really poorly this year. Usually we have a ton. It has a little, this actually I love. It's from my mom. My mom passed away in February, and we got, like, she had a whole collection of statues. And one of them is this little fairy that warms its hands by a candle that is set into a chestnut shell, half a chestnut shell. So that sits there, and another little candle, beeswax candle, and then the little autumn fairy that my daughter just made. So yeah, also that doesn't look at all alterish to
Right.
unsuspecting eyes, I think.
Well, it's
Yeah.
interesting because I think that we're drawn to creating these kind of tableaus. And when I
Yep.
was young, the first altar that I ever made, I absolutely would not have called it that. I wouldn't have thought about it in any way. I wouldn't have thought of that. I thought
Right.
altars were in churches.
Right.
And
Mhm.
so, but I was not a sporty child. I like to read a lot more than I like to run around. So
Uh-huh.
my grammar school was set up against a park. And there was between the proper park and the school was an area of woods. And there was this, I kind of drifted toward the edges of the playground because I didn't want to get targeted by any bullies, anything like that. And so I would oftentimes just sort of slip a little bit into the woods, and I'd still be close enough where I could hear the bell and all of that because I
Right.
was big on following rules and not being late. But there was this big rock that was just off the playground, and people couldn't see me, but I could still see them and hear what was going on. And I would go there every day, and I would pick little wildflowers, or if it was that time of year, I'd find pieces of moss or leaves, and I would decorate that rock every day. And and I just was thinking about how beautiful nature was and how much I liked arranging all of that. And that was really the first altar I ever built. It was a nature altar. So how do you incorporate folkloring in your daily life? What do you do? You're not wanting to, people don't have time. And so
Uh-huh.
what are some ideas that we can generate for people about how they can incorporate folkloring in a way that works with their lifestyle?
Yeah, exactly. And we just talked a lot about objects, but there's also actions, I believe. And especially if you can incorporate mindfulness, folklore, magic into everyday actions, that's when you're starting to really get somewhere, I think. And for me, I really see cleaning as an act of devotion, incorporating folklore and ancestry and all that magic into my life. So there's so many things that you can incorporate into that. Things like floor washes are in certain areas very traditional to use, or just like sometimes I simply, like, before I sweep, I'll put a little baking soda or salt on my floor and sweep that up as I sweep up the dust and things from the floor, just to have it a little extra energetic cleansing. There's things like washing and oiling door frames, window frames, things like that. I think for me personally, decluttering is such a spiritual practice, like in a sense of opening up space, like nature abhors a vacuum. So opening up space for new things to come into my life, but it's also just a psychological, yeah, this is proven now that and some people are more sensitive than others, but the more clutter there is around you, the less calm people tend to be.
Right.
So yeah, decluttering, cleaning for me are huge factors. And like a simple act of washing dishes, like I do have a dishwasher, thank goodness, but sometimes just washing dishes by hand is a really can be a really intentional and devotional practice.
Absolutely. And I think that it's interesting to think about just being mindful and when, you're doing what you were going to do anyway. I think that that's key. But adding little things like a floor wash that you've made yourself or that has a
Yeah.
scent that is meaningful to you. And so, again, you're going to be doing it. So you might as well think about how that spirituality and how those folk craft practices from before can be infused into your life.
Yeah, and so one thing that I want is that was it 2 years ago maybe in how to make a traditional Appalachia sweeper broom, which was a phenomenal experience, and I also got this phenomenal broom out of it, which like that is what I use to sweep my house, and that right there, like all natural, traditionally made by my hands. I chose the colors of the string that I tied the rope with intentionally, all that stuff. So just that simple fact of having that tool makes the whole thing a spiritual experience while I'm cleaning my house, which yeah is like makes cleaning a lot funner.
Sure.
Yeah, and it infuses your life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely the cleaning task that I hate the most is dusting because
Yeah.
when I was a little kid, my mom had a lot of stuff and dusting was my job. My brother got to vacuum, he'd be done in like 12 minutes. An hour later, I'm still there dusting
Yeah.
all these little things. But I do find that it's nice, particularly if I start with my altars, it's just nice to kind of get that feeling of taking away anything that's bogging down the
Yep.
energy of those spaces.
Yep.
And as far as decluttering, I think I've hit that age where I've stopped gathering things, and I used to have lots of collections. So many, I collected cameras for a while. I've collected so many different things, and now I want less. I want to be looking at less,
Yeah.
and I am very. A lot of people are kind of oriented like with audio, and they'll say like, oh, I hear what you're saying, or like visually, and they're like, oh, I see what you mean. But I'm kind of oriented spatially, and it's not a compulsive behavior, but I will walk into a room, and if something is not where it feels right, it will bother me a little bit. And I would never like go touch somebody else's stuff if I was at their house. But if the last guy I dated, and this is probably telling, but he would go around and like move things to see if I'd notice, and he was always annoyed when I did. So, but yeah, I feel like things feel better if they're spaced out right and they look right. But what I've realized is a lot of that is not getting too much clutter in the first place. So decluttering is key, I think.
Yep, exactly. Do we want to talk about cooking and food preparation in general?
Yeah, I think that we've touched on that with the herbs, and there's a lot of different ways to cook mindfully and to utilize what you were saying with your broom. Like I've got wooden spoons that I created in a course that I took on, again, traditional, like it was wood burning, and that's how we made the spoons. And so having things like those tools that are meaningful are great, but there's also different, I think people pick different kinds of cooking to engage in. It's like, it comes and goes in fads. A while back, it was very big around Chicago to do hard cider, to make your own hard cider. And so I did that for a while. But I think that now there's something else a little bit more popular, which is looking back at mead, which I think that that's a really interesting kind of throwback. And there's tons of folklore. We could do an entire episode around just brewing, distilling, fermenting, and there's so many different stories about it and the craft of doing all of that.
Yeah, I think we actually have one planned, if I look at my
list. So stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned for that. Yes, exactly. And when you were just talking about making your spoons, your wooden spoons, I have like a crock full of wooden spoons, and some are my mom's. And my favorite, there's like one wooden spoon that I use all the time, every day. Is like a very simple, beautiful, I think it's cherry spoon that my husband made. And then there is a very wonky, strange looking sort of ladle. It's starting to crack. It's really crazy. But my husband and I made that together. Like I would work a little bit on it and my hands would get tired and he would take over, and back and forth over like maybe a week or so, we made that spoon together. And that spoon also gets used all the time. So yeah, now we're, I guess, back at objects more than actions, but I did want to mention that. Yeah.
And I think that it's, again, what do you find? And I think that, yes, that those are objects. The spoons are objects, but the fact that you have a story around that of the action of creating that together. And it's an important story because you said yourself, you've got some spoons that had belonged to your mother, and your kids will have some stuff that belonged to you eventually. Yeah. And so it is, those stories are folklore, because folklore is any stories that are created between a group of people, right?
Yeah.
And so that's your building in that week, you are building part of your family's lore.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. What else did we want to talk about? Songs and storytelling. Something new that is very easily incorporated into a day-to-day and also very easily hidden from prying eyes, if that's what you would want to do. Yeah, so where I live in Appalachia, there is a long history of mountain ballads, which goes back to mostly the British Isles, which is just amazing. I worked with a woman, she was an English teacher who was also a storyteller, and she would sometimes in class just burst out into an Appalachia ballad, and it was just amazing. And I personally am not much of a singer, but even so, I will still learn traditional songs and sing them.
Yeah, I'm not much of a musician myself, but I think it's kind of funny because as we get older, we start to judge ourselves. But when you ask any little kid, like, "Hey, can you sing a song?" They're like, "Sure." Right. Or they'll come, running up and be like, "I have this story to tell you," and they'll ramble on and on and on, and and on. And there's a certain joy in just creating those things out of your imagination or through your body. And I think that it's a bit of a shame that we lose that wonder and that joy, and doing things like drumming and singing and telling stories. Those are all so innate within us that nobody's going to know that this is the story of you're just telling a story of how you and your husband made a spoon. They're not going to say, "Oh, well, is that your folklore?" You're just telling a story.
Right. Exactly.
And that joy of sharing is something we all really want. And that's an easy way to practice with folklore in your life.
Yeah. I am reminded by, like, I grew up with a ton of fairy tales being read to me, and I had like LPs, when we still had that, with stories on them that I would listen to over and over and over. And I've read a lot of fairy tales to my kids when they were little as well. And a lot of those are really just old European mythology repackaged. packaged. Like the Grimm
Right.
brothers did a pretty good job of collecting and repackaging, and there's definitely some problems with their stuff, but it is what we have right now. And then I'm also reminded of, I think it's an Albert Einstein quote who said, somebody asked him what should I do to make my children really smart? And he said, read them fairy tales. And if you want them to be really, really smart, read them more fairy tales.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that those stories do speak to us. And we talked about this last time, that some are morality tales
Yep.
and that kind of thing, or teaching us, some sort of lesson. But it's the telling of stories and even the adapting them for yourself or your surroundings. I think that those are all ways to easily connect to folklore. And you don't need anything for that. You don't need any objects at all. You just need to talk.
Right. Exactly. Mm-hmm.
As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider giving us a rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments, or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. You can find Tanya at Folklore Home Companion on Instagram, where she writes about European folklore and traditional life. You can find Tracy at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent and producing the Stories from the Hearth podcast. Hope to talk to you again soon.